Hey, what's going on, everybody? It's the CD guy, Johnny Z here. Thank you so much for tuning back into the channel. Gonna take a look here today in this rant video at 10 terrible rock and metal debut albums by great bands who got better really quick. You know, usually when I do a countdown, I have the album to show you guys, but in the case of this video, I don't own any of these records because I'm not a fan of any of them, but still I have opinions on all of them. I've heard them, and I'm just not a fan. But that being said, these are in no particular order. Let's get started here. I'm gonna go with Metal Magic here by Pantera from 1983. You know, Glamterra has its moments for sure, and you can definitely see that the potential was there for them to eventually break out and be something, but the band had their humble beginnings with the comically bad Metal Magic, very much in line with what other hair metal bands were doing around this time, inspired by Van Halen and Kiss as well, and it's a really generic record. It sounds super dated, and I'm not a big fan of the production here either, produced by the Abbott brothers' father, Jerry. So the real highlight here for me is Diamond Darrell's guitar work. Of course, it wasn't yet known as Dimebag Darrell here, and was only 19 at time of recording, which is pretty impressive. And, you know, one thing that's really interesting to examine when listening to the Pantera catalog, especially those early records, is, you know, the evolution of their sound over the years and how they improved on every record. You know, Terry Glaze does a decent job here on lead vocals, but I think bringing in Phil Anselmo a couple of years later for power metal was kind of the last piece of the puzzle, and then thankfully they figured everything out and put it all together by Cowboys from Hell, including ditching the glam metal thing, and just makes this record sound super cheesy in my opinion, all the way down to the awful album cover. Next up, how about Pretty's For You by Alice Cooper from 1969, the original Cooper band here under Frank Zappa's label, and the story goes that Zappa left his brother in charge of recording while Frank left for the day, and when he returned later on that day, he was informed the record was finished, having only recorded the band rehearsing, and yeah, by listening to this album, I'm tempted to believe that. The Alice Cooper band will admit themselves they didn't really know what they were doing on this record, they still hadn't found their identity yet, and it's a pretty disjointed album here. The band wouldn't really become Alice Cooper, in my eyes at least, until Love It to Death, but every band has to start somewhere, and, you know, it's not where I go when I'm interested in listening to the Alice Cooper sound, but, you know, it's very interesting to hear the band, you know, experimenting with some different arrangements here. It's very much influenced by Syd Barrett, but just kind of another example of a band going, well, we don't really know what we are just yet, so let's just mess around with prog and psychedelia and see what happens. You know, most of these albums, even though they're some of the weakest in these individual bands' discographies, usually have, you know, at least one or two redeeming qualities about them, but really can't say that for this next one here, going with Soul Crusher by White Zombie. You know, White Zombie didn't really arrive for me until Make Them Die Slowly in 1989, but their first full-length studio album is a hard one to sit through, you know, all the way for sure. And the band initially took more of a noise rock approach here, and this record just kind of feels like the band experimenting with different sounds on cheap equipment, and it's hard to really focus on one particular instrument or aspect of the band's sound at this point because, you know, just feel like they were throwing so much at the wall here, and, you know, at once to seeing what would stick, trying to be artsy and punk while trying to make their way out of the underground noise rock scene of New York City. The riffs are bland and forgettable, and Rob Zombie's vocals sound completely muddled. The production is atrocious, and Iggy Pop was apparently a big fan of this record, which I can totally see, but I think transitioning to a more heavy metal meets groove metal sound was the best thing that could have possibly happened for White Zombie after this train wreck of a debut. We have another head-scratcher here, number 4, with Sympathy by Ministry, released in 1983. Al Jourgensen going in, you know, a synth-pop, new wave type direction for the band's debut record, and with Sympathy will never not feel like a fever dream to me. You know, I don't think the album had really much originality to it, and Al sounds totally out of his element here, including randomly and hilariously speaking in an English accent for most of this record, which certainly was an artistic choice, I'll give him that, but it doesn't really make any sense. But that being said, Effigy is one of my favorite Ministry songs of all time for reasons I still don't understand, but the rest of this record does nothing for me, and I'd much rather listen to the Industrial Ministry than anything else, you know, on their misguided debut record, and thankfully they would move to a darker, more industrial sound with Twitch 3 years later. Next up, Angels Fall First by Nightwish, a really rough around the edges debut album here, which the band have since called essentially an extended demo, but there are bigger issues here, in my opinion, including founding member Tuomas Holopainen on co-lead vocals with Tarja Turunen, and I'm not a fan at all of his vocals here, and it's no coincidence this would be the last time he would take on co-vocal duties, and with that being said, though, you could absolutely hear the seeds being planted here for the greatness of the rest of the Tarja era, and I do think the title track is pretty underrated, but aside from that, this album is a far cry from the band's best work and what they would do in just a few short years. From Genesis to Revelation by Genesis, which reminds me I do owe you guys a Genesis album ranking. Next time I do a progressive rock band album ranking, it will be Genesis, so stay tuned for that at some point. I haven't forgotten about it, I promise, but their debut album here would definitely be down towards the bottom of that list because, you know, the band were still, well, in the genesis of creating their sound and finding their place by the time of their 1969 debut, and if you're a fan of 60s orchestral pop, this record might be for you, but for me personally, it's not a go-to Genesis record, in the sense that it's a far cry from the classic sound that we all know and love. It's less proggy and more psychedelic pop, just kind of like what I was talking about with the Alice Cooper Band's debut. It's the band messing around with psychedelia while they were still looking for their identity here, and the record was a commercial flop around its release, and interestingly enough, is the only album of theirs that the band don't own. Next up, let's go with Symphony X's self-titled debut from 1994, and I figured that would be a half-decent transition here from the humble beginnings of one legendary progressive rock band to the humble beginnings of one legendary progressive metal band with Symphony X, and the album, which otherwise is full of really interesting instrumentation by the band, is completely ruined by awful production. I mean, it just sounds terrible. It gives me a headache to listen to this album, and the vocals on this record by Rod Tyler sound like they were recorded in a different room, and I like Michael Romeo's guitar work here, but that's really about it. Improving the production, I think, and bringing in Russell Allen were the two best things the band could have possibly done after this release, and with that being said, their next album, The Damnation Game from 1995, almost feels like an entirely different band. In my eyes, German heavy metal legends Accept didn't really become Accept until 1981's Breaker, when they finally put things together, but the band started out with self-titled in 1978, a really disjointed effort that lacked any real focus. It was just kind of thrown together and composed the tracks the band had previously written in their formative years, and you have bassist Peter Baltus performing lead vocals on two tracks here, those being Sea Winds and Sounds of War, and Peter has an interesting voice, but those songs don't really do anything for me on this record, and I would say nothing on this album is top shelf Accept or anything close to it. The production is poor, and the album lacks any real cohesion that the band would find in the early 80s. Following that up here, let's go with the self-titled debut of David Bowie here. This is a young Davy Jones, still trying to find his footing with, this Baroque pop type of record, and Bowie just hadn't found his edge yet. This is him still in the Laughing Gnome era, and the album is severely lacking compared to the rest of Bowie's solo catalog. I think it lacks a lot of his own identity and originality, and it just seems misguided in hindsight, but everyone has to start somewhere, I guess, and, for what it's worth, some of the lyrics on here are pretty interesting, and the song Silly Boy Blue would be re-recorded for the Toy sessions in the early 2000s, which it sounds much better on Toy, I'll give you that. I think it was a missed opportunity not to include the London Boys on this record as well. Just hard to compare, this version of Bowie and this sound to, say, a Ziggy Stardust or a Thin White Duke. And last but not least here, we have Lonesome Crow by the Scorpions, recorded in about a week by the Scorpions, and their only studio album with 16-year-old Michael Schenker on guitar. His solos on this album are fantastic, and definitely my favorite part of this record. This is Schenker pre-UFO. Just a phenomenal talent here, and really elevates this album, which otherwise, feels like a lost band struggling to find a direction here. And once again, it's a young band looking for a signature style, messing around with psychedelia until they found it. And largely, I don't think it plays to the band's strengths, of each individual member. The darker, more melodic sound of early Scorpions is also on display here, but the band just kind of seems lost and unsure of themselves and where to go next at this point, and I feel like the band would have better luck working with Uli John Roth, who really helped usher them into the first classic era in the 70s, and that said, In Search of Peace of Mind, though, was a great ballad. Love the version from the Tokyo tapes. So that wraps up this video here, taking a look at 10 terrible debut albums by great rock and metal bands who would improve real quick following these train wreck debut albums, and some of these are varying degrees of, worse than others, but just in general, some of the weakest, I think, in their respective catalogs. You got to see my picks right over here. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel down below, turn on the bell for notifications so you don't miss a new upload, and let me know down in the comment section below what are your thoughts on my choices and what are some of your least favorite rock and metal debuts of all time. I want to hear from you. And until next time, it's the CD guy, Johnny Z, signing off. Take care, everybody.